identifying underrepresented. Good morning, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to session 1, Life After MPLP, Identifying Underrepresented Voices and Collections through a repository-wide collection survey. Please be advised that this session is being recorded. We ask that you please use the Q&A feature to pose questions to the panel. We will relay those questions to the panelists to close out the session. And at this time, I will turn the session over to our presenters from Cornell University.
Okay, hello everyone. Let me just take a moment to make sure people can hear us. If someone wants to throw a thumbs up in the chat or in the webinar. Wonderful. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Sorry for the late start. Technical difficulties, as always with these things. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our session, Life After MPLP, Identifying Underrepresented Voices in Collections through a Repository-Wide Survey. First off, I'm going to introduce myself and my two co-presenters. My name is Elizabeth Parker. I am the Technical Services Archivist here at the Cornell Kheel Center for Labor Management, Documentation, and Archives.
Folks, I'm Ben Rubel. I'm the Processing Archivist here at the Kheel Center.
And I'm Claire Dang, and I am the Collection Survey Assistant at the Kheel Center.
Okay, so I just want to start with a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. I'm going to briefly give the history of our repository, our collections, and previous practices, followed by how we were able to advocate for this project and some of our early top-level planning. Next, Ben Rubel will present on the work we did to design and scope the survey, creating our survey instrument and our survey workflows. Claire will discuss using the survey instrument, some interesting finds she's made, and how the survey work has impacted other areas of archival work. And finally, I will finish up the presentation by discussing how we work as a group on this project. And after we finish up, we should have about 15 minutes for Q&A from the audience. Finally, before we get going, I have a brief poll for everyone. Let's see if it launches. The first question is how many attendees today have embarked on or even completed a repository-wide survey of their collections? And for those of you who answer no, how many of you are thinking of maybe attempting a project like this? And I'll just give it a couple of seconds for you all to vote. Okay, so it looks like we have slightly more of people who have not, but it's a pretty even split. And for those who have answered no, it looks like the majority of you, probably understandably, are interested in doing something like this. And our hope is that by the end of this presentation, you all will have some new ideas and tools you can use in your own repository. Okay. On to the next slide. So the Kheel Center for Labor Management, Documentation, and Archives is one of 3 repositories at Cornell University. We were founded in 1945 by the state of New York as part of the ILR, or Industrial and Labor Relations School. The school was founded with the hope that if the leaders of labor and management were educated in the same place by the same instructors, future negotiations between parties would go smoother. Whether or not this lofty goal was met can certainly be debated, but in order to support that goal, an archive that collected materials from both labor and management was deemed necessary to support that goal. That is the Kheel Center. We collect extensively on the world of work from as many perspectives as possible. We have extensive holdings from various unions from such industries as the needle trades and textile workers, railroads, teachers, public sector workers, and labor education. We also hold the papers of numerous arbitrators, have extensive holdings of collective bargaining agreements, union contracts, and work-related legislative materials. We also collect materials from Fortune 500 companies, papers from scientific management scholars, and from restructuring consultants and union busting firms. Finally, we also house the archives from the American Textile History Museum, which closed in 2017. Those holdings contain the records of various New England textile manufacturers from the 1700s to the end of the 20th century. Our collections document essentially every group of people in this country who have ever worked. However, the metadata describing these collections does not always make this clear, which was one of the driving forces behind my decision to start advocating for a survey that would allow us to evaluate where we could do a better job. Like all archives, we have inherited the end products of previous workflows and decisions made by our predecessors. I do want to take a moment here to say that we deeply value the work of those who came before us and recognize that they were doing the best they could with what they had at the time. I also know that there's a 100% chance that in 20 or 30 years, another archivist will be cursing some of the decisions that we are making right now. When my predecessor, sorry.
I'm very sorry to interrupt, but we have a request to shift the slideshow into presentation view. And also, I just want to make sure that you're on the right slide. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
I am in presentation mode, at least in my screen. Let's try again. Is this showing in presentation?
No.
Wonderful. Okay, let's try screen one. Is that in presentation mode?
Yep, that's it.
Okay. Oh, golly. So I see what was happening. Yes, apologies for that. So here was my first slide, and here is the slide that I am currently speaking on. Apologies. Okie doke. Okay, sorry, finding my spot again. Okay. When my predecessor was hired in 2008, he arrived to a processing room filled floor to ceiling with boxes that had never been accessioned, let alone arranged or described. He tackled this problem head on by instituting an MPLP processing plan. In a truly Herculean effort, he, our cataloger at the time, and a small army of student workers went through all the materials, created basic stub catalog records, rehoused the materials in archival boxes, created box inventories, and foldered the materials, mostly. Claire will have some remarks about how well this was done. And then they created very basic finding aids using an Access database built CMS that we call KidB, that my predecessor had heavily modified for Kheel's needs. At the end of roughly 6 years of work, the Kheel Center no longer had a backlog. Every item was in a collection, every collection was accessioned and somewhat described, and every collection was discoverable through either the catalog or through a finding aid. The plan was then to circle back to the beginning and describe the collections, whether in response to research demand as per MPLP or in a more holistic way. However, right around the time that was to begin, the Kheel Center acquired the holdings of the American Textile History Museum, which arrived in 8 semi-tractor trailers. So my predecessor was tasked with accessioning those materials. And as you can imagine, that took up most of his remaining time here. I knew the state of Keel's collections as I had worked here for 2 years on a grant-funded project prior to moving into my current role. In fact, the job talk I gave in 2018, I proposed that I would conduct some sort of survey to evaluate this known issue and then would then take steps to correct it. I was very naive in thinking I could do this by myself. As I said, I was aware of the problems when I moved into this position, but I also knew the quality of work that had been done and was thus well positioned to identify and call attention to the unintended consequences of MPLP. I could very easily identify a collection that I knew saw extensive use by patrons, but was not housed in the best manner and had extremely minimal or incorrect metadata. In many cases, patrons were able to find data because of the extensive knowledge our reference staff had of our collection. As a result, I began to collect data around collection use and level of description. And outside of some edge cases, there was a real correlate there. After all, how discoverable is a collection if it has a 1-sentence abstract, 1 or 2 access points, and then a box inventory of hundreds of folders called meeting minutes? The answer, of course, is not very. We also had instances of donors reaching out and asking about how their materials were described or not, as the case may be, that brought more attention to these issues. The constant struggle I faced, however, was that we were still acquiring collections. In the first year, when I was the only archivist in the technical services department, we brought in 3 large organizational collections, each over 200 cubic feet. It was hard to advocate to my director that I should be allowed extensive time to survey what was, to a certain extent, described and processed, when I also had to accession, rehouse, and create inventory lists for 600 cubic feet of materials with only a cataloger and some student workers to help me. The emphasis on collecting without any thought to the needs of the collections themselves did not seem sustainable to me, and I made a bit of a pest of myself, constantly advocating to those above me for more attention to be paid to these issues, or at least to create a position to allow for better processing of the collections we were acquiring to avoid adding to what I have taken to calling our soft backlog. Interestingly, Cornell University Library is currently drafting a new strategic plan, and one of the areas that has received a lot of focus is sustainable stewardship. I think it's telling that this recognition, also present in discussions around slow librarianship and slow archiving, is becoming part of our profession's discussion around these issues. It has also very much helped this collection survey get institutional buy-in, given how well it aligns with our administration's goals. Prior to this new strategic plan, and even prior to the hiring of our new university librarian who is spearheading the plan, a series of events allowed me to make progress on implementing what I had decided was needed, namely a survey to review both the physical housing and level of description of all of our collections to create a 5-year processing plan for the Kheel Center collections. I had started by advocating for a processing assistant, but due to retirements during the COVID-19 pandemic, an academic line became available, and I was able to work with my director to create a processing archivist position at the Kheel Center. Prior to the creation of this position, now filled by Ben Rubel, who will be speaking next, all processing archivists at Kheel had been grant-funded term employees. Also, in 2022, when our new university librarian started, she put great emphasis on sustainable stewardship, and so much so that it is one of our tent poles of our strategic plan, and I will return to that in a couple of slides. But prior to the strategic plan, her commitment to sustainable stewardship and responsible collecting was demonstrated in our posting for a new AUL of special collections. One of the main core competencies that our UL put in the job posting was the ability to assess and redress issues of extant collections at CUL, such as dealing with backlogs, better describing our materials, etc. The clear interest and support for the type of work I was proposing to do with the survey from upper administration was immensely helpful in gaining additional support. My then library director was able to secure funds and worked with me to create a staff position, the collections survey assistant, and we hired Claire to fill that role in November of 2023. While reparative description has always been part of my individual work, I also wanted to make sure that it was a key part of this project. After the murder of George Floyd, metadata workers at Cornell formed the Inclusive Descriptive Practices Task Force in order to examine our practice and to create a central body where our work in different units could be discussed and standardized. The work I did and continued through informed these results. As part of this group, inform these areas that I have prioritized as part of our survey and the redescription we are undertaking as a result. So for example, we are evaluating the accuracy of the description and the usefulness of the description, as well as what problematic language may or may not be present in our records. We are trying to standardize our description across the board, and we are also evaluating our access points, because one of the end results of MPLP was that our collections tend to either have 2 access points, such as the creator name and a very generic subject field such as labor, or something like 2 to 500 subject headings listing the name of every single union and corporation that may or may not be present within the records of those collections, neither of which, quite frankly, is helpful for researchers. We are also evaluating our missing descriptive fields and identifying places where metadata drift has occurred between various systems. returning to the idea of sustainable stewardship, as I mentioned earlier, this has become a core component of CUL's strategic plan. And in fact, between writing this presentation and today, the finalized plan has been shared to CUL employees, so it's no longer drafting, it has been drafted. That being said, how does this sort of intersect with the survey, and what are the sustainability concerns that we have? And here are some questions that have come up in the course of this work. I don't have answers to these questions, but I think asking them and keeping them in the forefront of our minds helps us in our work. And this really leads into what does this sustainable stewardship mean in terms of acquisitions and collection building strategies? What does it mean in terms of our responsibilities to our collections? With the sub-question of for whom are we collecting, and why are we valuing the amount that is brought in versus the amount described, or perhaps even the amount weeded from collection? What does sustainable mean in terms of the labor of library and archive workers? And how can we justify bringing in new collections if we're not doing our best by those that we already have? And so finally, I just wanted to briefly summarize the first steps that allowed us to successfully launch this survey. And it was hiring a processing archivist and a survey assistant. It was identifying the scope of the project, identifying the appropriate tools that we would need to successfully conduct this project, and identify appropriate collections. The Kheel Center has traditionally separated our collections out so that we will, for example, have a photo collection, a records collection, and a graphics collection, as opposed to one collection with individual series. This was the choice that I inherited, but what it means in terms of this survey is we have been able to, at least for this first round, focus purely on our manuscript collections. We have also, and we have also, we also established our goals, which is a prioritized processing plan for our collections that'll lead and increasing the discoverability of our collections and improving the descriptions, all while keeping in mind our overarching focus of surfacing the voices and records of marginalized people. And I will now pass the mic to Ben.
Right. So we consulted a number of sources before designing the survey and found that there was clearly interest in this topic about 15 years ago, but less literature on it has been produced in recent years. This, in large part, may be attributed to the Council on Library and Information Resources 2008 Cataloging Hidden Special Collections and Archives program, which provided funding for cataloging and processing undescribed collections, which were often surfaced through survey work. The irony of this is that through this national effort, many collections were processed using MPLP during this period, and as Liz mentioned, the Kheel Center doesn't so much have hidden collections in that they are undescribed, but hidden material that is underdescribed as a result of MPLP. But nonetheless, the proliferation of surveys and reports that came out of this period greatly informed our project. While much of what we reviewed were secondary sources that described best practices for surveys, others were actual surveys and survey instruments that were publicly available, like those from the Philadelphia Area Consortium of Special Collections Libraries and UC Berkeley's Bancroft Library. From all of this, we learned about possible criteria to survey, about how to scope survey projects and set priorities, and about ways to quantify subjective areas like research value. All of this higher level information was extremely useful, but none of it gave us clear guidelines for what systems or tools we could use to create our own survey instrument. So from there, we had to experiment a bit. Next slide, please. Our earliest prototype was created in Excel back before we fully realized the complexity of the project and the type of tools that it would demand. Around that time, we had started using Airtable to manage our incoming collections prior to accessioning. Airtable is a spreadsheet database hybrid, which also allows for the creation of forms to input data, and it's overall very customizable. So we borrowed the idea to use it for pre-accessions from Cornell's other main archives, the Division of Rare and Manuscript Collections, and later on found that a couple other groups in the library were using Airtable. So there was an existing institutional membership, support from library IT, and a community of users to help with troubleshooting. So after getting some experience designing forms and tracking collections through various stages of the pre-accession process, it became clear that this would be a great tool for the survey. I will note that after fully committing to Airtable, we learned about some of the accessibility issues it has, specifically its lack of compatibility with screen readers, its lack of keyboard control, so you need to use a mouse to navigate through it, and issues with zoom, text size, and color contrast. So this is definitely something to consider if you're looking at Airtable for your survey, but by the time we learned this, we were months into the project, so we decided to continue to use it despite these issues. Another important thing to note about our technical context is that around the time the survey was in its planning stages, we'd also begun to migrate our data at Kheel into archive space. This meant that we had lots and lots of spreadsheets with collection data at our disposal, and staff from the library's cataloging and metadata service units already supporting us. The Kheel Center's own public services staff likewise helped by sending us spreadsheets of reference statistics and requests, which I cleaned using OpenRefine, to get a rough idea of collections that patrons were using or inquiring about. I collated all of this data into one big spreadsheet, about 2,000 collection numbers, titles, extents, and finding aid URLs, along with the number of subject headings used for each and the number of hits a collection received in our reference data. So I uploaded this into Airtable and used this as a baseline. This was a really important step for us, as initially we had planned to have student assistants gather this info and copy it over into Airtable from our various systems. So this ultimately saved us time and labor and eliminated human error from the process. So now our empty Airtable project was populated with all of the relevant collection data from our various systems, and we began to hone in on what information would be most important to gather about each. Next slide, please. So as Liz mentioned, we wanted the result of our survey to be a list of collections ranked by their processing priority. This meant that we needed to set some priorities for what we wanted those top ranked collections to look like. So the first priority was that we wanted collections that relate to marginalized groups to be highlighted. Because of the general issue of minimal description at Kheel, the contributions to labor history of marginalized groups, while often documented in our collections, is generally omitted from descriptions, so we wanted to identify these collections and highlight these contributions in our finding aids. Eventually, we also realized that equally important is that collections with serious conservation concerns, regardless of content, would also need to be prioritized to meet our custodial standards. We also wanted the survey to be responsive to researcher interests, both current and anticipated. So we used reference statistics to highlight collections that have been of high interest to researchers in recent years, and also devised a list of topical areas that we anticipate researchers would be interested in if they could discover these collections. So we highlighted these as well. Next slide, please. With our priorities set and our survey criteria laid out, we moved towards designing the survey instrument in Airtable. Given that our criteria reflected a range of both physical and intellectual properties, we laid out the instrument as a two-step process using Airtable's interface function, which is essentially a type of highly customizable form. All of the initial uploaded data is presented in the conservation metadata interface, which is the first step. You can see that blue rectangle in the middle here. And when these aspects of a collection have been surveyed, the collection is pushed to the arrangement and description interface, the rectangle on the right. Next slide, please. So I'll do a quick walkthrough of these interfaces. First, the conservation metadata interface. This is where boxes are physically inspected for conservation issues and basic top-level metadata is reviewed. Claire will be discussing this in more details in a few minutes, so I'll just briefly share these screenshots. Here you can see the metadata fields we fill out, and I'll get into the scoring system and some of the specifics in a few slides. Next, please. On to the conservation portion, which is more straightforward. Here we rate the foldering, the boxes, whether they're underfilled, overfilled, or just right, and a free text field to explain any specifics or to indicate any particular problematic boxes or folders that we find. Next, please. So the next step we call the arrangement and description interface, which entails analyzing the existing descriptive metadata, the arrangement of the collection, and the content of the collection. And this is where we look out for marginalized groups and assess the potential research value of a collection. As you can see from the screenshots, every rating consists of both a number and a description, and the numbers fall in different ranges. Next, please. So on the back end of Airtable, I make this work through formulas and some hidden fields. For every field with a number, score, and description, there is a hidden field based on a formula, which you can see here, that takes that information and removes everything except for the numerical digits. These hidden fields are what are actually tallied to give us our overall scores, but they're hidden away and locked for user edits. So they're just sort of an invisible automatic process, but the numerical scores are what actually make our ranking system possible. Next, please. So in order to ensure that our priorities were reflected in the scoring system, we weighed the various criteria differently. So yes, we want to know which collections have paper clips that need to be removed. So the fasteners rating has a maximum score of 5. But identifying marginalized groups is a major priority of the survey, so that ranking goes up to 10. Overall, high scores indicate that the collection should be higher on the processing priority list, but also that the collection is a realistic processing project. So by that, I mean, do we have the resources to actually reprocess this collection as part of our day-to-day work? Does it make functional sense to be at the top of our list, or will we just have to skip over it indefinitely when selecting projects? For our collections that are hundreds of linear feet, the answer is no, so this is baked into the survey. Larger collections actually get fewer points for their extent score, pushing them lower in our ranking. Likewise, highly restricted collections receive fewer points for the restrictions field, because ultimately we don't want to prioritize redescribing a collection that researchers won't even be able to access. Next slide, please. Before embarking on the full survey, we conducted a pilot project, surveying about 30 collections that we selected to give us a diverse sampling of Kheel collections in terms of collecting area, size, condition, and decade of accession. Through the pilot, I was able to adjust the survey in real time. In particular, I was able to refine our survey criteria and solidify the definitions of our terms. The survey relies on evaluations of physical and intellectual properties of material that are in some cases very subjective. So through the pilot, I had to apply that theoretical criteria we devised to real-life examples, which often are more complex than a 1 to 5 rating can capture. So through this learning process, I ended up adding various free text fields to the survey where I could take notes to help capture some of the complexity and detail that the simple scoring system could not. You saw many of those fields on the previous slides. In terms of scores, the pilot project also gave me the opportunity to adjust the ranking of our survey criteria, emphasizing and de-emphasizing fields, ensuring that the final ranked list of collections actually reflected our priorities. The pilot was our proof of concept for library administration, who could see that the project ultimately would deliver what it promised. This led to funding for a full-time position, which Claire was then hired for. So having Claire on board was a total game changer for us and prompted us to retool the survey to accommodate a full-time staff member. A full-time position ensured much faster progress on the survey, but also allowed us to add some complexity and separate workflows to the project. With our team growing, we also created a survey manual to document how the instrument should be used and to define our ratings and terms. Next slide, please. So through this flowchart, you can see everything we've discussed so far. This is kind of the skeleton of the survey, which in the next few slides, you'll see expand. We have collections and use data that populate our metadata conservation interface, which Claire runs each collection through. When she's done, she pushes the collection to the arrangement and description queue for my review, and when I'm done, all of the scores that we each assigned are tallied and the collection is added in its ranked position to our prioritized processing list. So our processing list helps us prioritize collections in the long term, but in the short term, a lot of issues and collections have come up that through Claire's work, we've been able to remediate almost immediately. Next slide, please. In surveying collections for conservation concerns, we started to amass a list of collections that we called conservation quick fixes. These are collections that have smaller issues that can be dealt with immediately. So typically this means a smaller collection that needs to be moved into acid-free folders, a box that needs a spacer, paper clips that need to be removed. The types of small things that you find and that you just want to deal with now rather than put it back on the shelf and come back to it later. So for more delicate material or complicated fixes, we send those to a queue for Claire to work on. Next slide, please. But for simpler work, we send the collection to a separate student work queue for our student assistants, which is a very limited version of Airtable that our students have access to. Next slide, please. And next one. So back in Airtable, you can see what this actually looks like. Through this student work queue, students are able to find quick fix projects to work on, claim them, and mark them as complete when they're done. When a quick fix is completed, we go back to the conservation interface and adjust the ratings to reflect the collection's new and improved housing or folder labeling. Next slide. Going back to the flowchart, at this early stage, if we encounter harmful description, under-described material related to marginalized communities, or just material that will definitely be of interest to researchers but is poorly described, we have another queue that allows us to flag these examples to make sure that they don't slip through the cracks. Next slide, please. So flagged collections will eventually go through the rest of the survey where I will evaluate them more comprehensively, but this gives us a quick and dirty list of collections that definitely need redescription. From this list, Claire and I have a weekly work session where we reprocess collections selected from the list. So similar to our conservation quick fix queue, this is another side workflow that's an offshoot of the main survey that lets us remediate some problems that we find along the way. Next slide, please. And we've surfaced many collections through the survey that potentially should be removed on a records retention schedule. As the repository for Cornell School of Industrial and Labor Relations, we have a wide variety of office files, many of which have publicly available finding aids, and many of which should have been discarded some time ago. As we find questionable collections such as these, we add them to a records retention list for Liz to review. Unlike our other queues, collections tagged for a records retention review are taken out of the survey until Liz deaccessions them or releases them back into the survey workflow to have their arrangement and description surveyed. And this is because we don't want to put more resources towards collections that may soon be deaccessioned. All of the other workflows we discussed can happen simultaneously. So a collection can be in the conservation quick fix queue and be flagged for arrangement and description, or even be through with the entire survey but remain in these side queues. But for collections that we're not even sure we'll keep, they hit a dead end until we make a decision about them. Airtable is really fluid in this regard. It allows us to view a collection through different stages simultaneously and route things based on conditional logic and Boolean operators. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up, here's the very top of our prioritized processing list as it stands today. You can see the individual scores and our cumulative total scores and how they kind of vary. So for number 3 on the list, the American Association for Social Security Records, our description score is actually closer to the middle of our scale. So remember that the points go up to 50 for each side, description and conservation. So that's closer to the middle, but the conservation score is almost as high as it can go. So the physical condition of this collection is what really brings it to the top of the list. And the opposite is true for number 8, the United Housing Foundation files. It's of high interest to researchers, documents the contributions of marginalized groups and labor, and its arrangement and description need work. So it still rises to the top, despite the fact that its physical condition is actually in okay shape. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Claire to talk about her work surveying collections through the metadata and conservation interface.
Thanks, Ben. So as the survey assistant, I primarily carry out the metadata and conservation part of the survey. For the metadata portion, I cross-check finding aids with the collections database for inconsistencies and restrictions and record metrics like location, box data, and subject headings. For the conservation portion, I physically inspect collections. So I'm going into the stacks, opening boxes, and looking at what's inside. I then evaluate metadata and conservation and select ratings according to criteria outlined in the survey manual that Ben and Liz created. One thing that was built into the conservation portion before I started was that it was not necessary to check every box for collections that had more than 10 boxes in them to get a good idea of their overall physical condition and conservation issues. So instead, I sample a portion of these larger collections using a formula shown here. For both the metadata and conservation portions, Ben designed the survey to take in inputs in various formats, and I'll show you what that looks like in the next slides. Next, please. So this is an example of the metadata interface for the Serafino Romualdi papers. As you can see, I filled out rating scales for things like restrictions and location, and I can pick between options for the restrictions, but for restriction type, it's a check all that applies. Below that, I use the EAD notes field to elaborate on discrepancies between the EAD and collections database and to note problematic language in the EAD. This is different from the metadata notes field, which we actually added after I started so I could copy over specific notes on restrictions and note any other metadata issues not pertaining to the EAD. As Ben mentioned, he also evaluates for EAD issues in problematic description in the arrangement and description part of the survey, but I act as the first pass, which enables us to catch more problems between the two of us, especially when it comes to harmful or outdated language. Next, please. This is an example of the conservation interface for the Edwin S. Smith papers. So when I do conservation, I use a notebook to document problems as I check each box, then review and summarize those notes after checking all the boxes to fill out the conservation ratings and free text fields. On the left, you can see the rating scales I filled out, which sum up the overall state of folders, paper condition, etc. for the collection. I elaborate on these ratings in the conservation free text field shown on the right, which is where I can add detail and highlight atypical problems and outlier cases not reflected in the ratings. I also use this field to document any materials of interest I find during my conservation checks, such as the presence of marginalized groups or anything else of significant archival or historical value that isn't already in the finding aid. So in this example, I've circled the notes I've made on materials of interest in red, which tells us that this collection has material of general historical value, like the interviews with labor leaders, as well as material on people of color and marginalized groups, with the documents related to A. Philip Randolph, Martin Luther King Jr., and civil rights. Next, please. Early on in the survey, I also created a separate Excel sheet for myself to track my progress, which serves several important functions. It allows me to see when I've finished the metadata and conservation for each collection, and it records the number of boxes in each collection, which allows me to track the number of boxes I check per day and per month. This is often a better measure of progress than just looking at the number of collections I've surveyed, since collections can vary in size from one box to hundreds. Having these stats on hand has also been helpful when reporting out and advocating for support to library administrators to show them the progress we're making on the survey. The spreadsheet also automates the formula I mentioned earlier for how many boxes I need to check for the larger collections. Next, please. The automation of the formula in the spreadsheet allowed me to do some long-term planning that helped us refine the focus of our survey. I wanted to estimate how many boxes I would need to check over the course of the survey because I quickly realized that box checking would take up most of my time. I used the spreadsheet to calculate the number of boxes I needed to check in collections larger than 10 cubic feet, which ended up being over 6,000 boxes. So we decided to deprioritize collections in the survey that had been reprocessed recently as part of a grant project, for example, because we knew their physical condition would be relatively good. The deprioritized checkbox in Airtable separates these collections from the main queue, which ended up reducing the total number of boxes by about 1,000, which is a pretty significant difference of about 3 to 4 months of my time. After I started, we discovered other small issues that prompted refinement of the survey tool itself. I already mentioned that we added the metadata notes field for restriction details, but we also found out that several collections in the survey had boxes in different repositories across campus. We were told this couldn't happen, but it did, so we added a split rating to account for it. As we began evaluating collections for quick fixes, we also realized that size and cubic footage didn't give us enough information to make decisions. A collection could be less than 10 cubic feet, but if it was made up of 15 upright Hollinger boxes, that would require a lot more processing time than, say, 2 RCs. So we added the box count and type field. These are just a few examples of how my work implementing the survey gave us the information we needed to further improve it. which emphasizes how iterative the process of creating and refining the survey has been. Next, please. So as a result of my conservation checks, we discovered some quirks of previous Kheel processing, which apparently included using any object they had on hand as box spacers. These are just a few of many bad spacers I found. I think my favorite is the cardboard bent into a triangle, just because I think it's so creative. While these are mostly funny and mildly concerning to look at, it goes to show how the MPLP approach and budget limitations in the past may have led to decisions that were quick and easy and may have been the best they could do at the time, but were ultimately not good for properly housing collections in the long term, which we're trying to remedy now with the survey. Next, please. Not everything I find in the collections is a bad surprise. These are some of the very random but kind of delightful things I found. My favorite one is probably the cat stationery, which we found in abundance of in a faculty collection. And while they may not have much historical value, these finds go a long way in humanizing the authors and subjects of our collections, whether they be renowned ILR faculty, labor leaders, or archivists themselves. Next, please. The survey has also had a pretty immediate benefit for public services because we unearthed previously undiscovered or underdescribed materials of historical or archival significance, which we've been able to use to enhance Keel's public services and outreach work in the past year. For example, I've made a few social media posts for Keel's Instagram and Twitter about things I've uncovered, like this one at the bottom right of an 1199 News investigative report on union busting. In our industrial labor relations school collections, I also discovered blueprints of old ILR buildings, which included this one of faculty offices that showed Frances Perkins's office. She was the first female cabinet member and Secretary of Labor under FDR. So during alumni reunion in May, we were able to show these blueprints for the first time in our exhibit on ILR history. At the same event, we also had an alumna show up asking if we had a copy of her thesis on drug culture on college campuses in the late 1960s, which I had actually come across and flagged in the survey. So we were able to pull it out for her. And this led to a great conversation with her and other alumni about her research and life on campus in the late 60s. Finally, at the top right is a photo of a speech I found that was made by Martin Luther King Jr. in 1957 at a United Packing House Workers of America conference, which we discovered isn't publicly accessible online anywhere and is only held at a couple of other archives in the country. And Kheel is also one of only 2 places to have audio excerpts of King speaking at this event. The important thing to note about this is that I found this transcript within the Edwin and S. Smith papers, which is mostly subject files with no direct connection to King, and within a series of 13 folders, all titled Discrimination in the Finding Aid. These are the kinds of items that really emphasize the importance of and need for this survey, because these items that have been overlooked for years, maybe even decades, because of lack of description, can now be made available for public access and research. Already, the knowledge of our collections that I've accumulated from the survey has allowed me to answer research questions more accurately and to tell researchers that we do actually have materials in the subjects that they're looking for. So even though the survey is a technical services project, it has had real-time material benefits for public services and our archive as a whole in ways beyond what I think anyone could have anticipated at the survey's conception. Next, please. So we are about 1 year into the survey now. So to wrap up my section, here are some stats showing what we've accomplished so far. I have reviewed 747 collections for conservation and metadata, and across these collections, I've checked over 2,900 boxes with a monthly average about 15 to 20 boxes per day. 269 collections have been fully surveyed, so they've gone through both metadata and conservation and arrangement and description. And 111 collections have been quick fixed for metadata and conservation issues by me or students. And now I'll hand it back to Liz to talk about our survey meetings and evaluating quick fixes.
Thanks, Claire. I'm going to be cognizant of time and kind of go through this a little quickly to make sure that we do leave time for Q&A from the audience. So I'm going to briefly talk about our weekly survey meetings where we do a lot of this top level work. And then I will also discuss a specific collection that's been through the survey and has been redescribed and reprocessed by Ben and Claire. So I mentioned earlier Cornell's IDPTF, which is our inclusive description group, and that group was formed at the grassroots level. In that it was formed by concerned metadata practitioners at Cornell reaching out to each other and forming this community. And it was not something that was formed top down, for example, by an edict from our administration. And as a result, the work style of that group has always been very inclusive, small I, in that every member has equal standing to discuss, debate, or bring forward ideas to the group. And I wanted to follow a similar path with our survey meetings. So they are structured to use a dialectical approach with an emphasis on decisions being reached through conversation and consensus. As both Claire and Ben emphasized, this is an iterative project, and the structure allows for us to adapt quickly as needed. So in our weekly meetings, as both Ben and Claire have covered, we review the quick fixes, we talk through the survey instrument, make any additional tweaks that might have been needed, we'll assign tasks to each other. Sometimes it will be something along the lines of this collection is a quick fix, but it houses a couple of photographs or some very old or delicate material. And therefore it is assigned to Claire rather than to our student workers because she has greater skill working with that. Conversely, we might look at something that is slightly more complicated in terms of its descriptive needs, but in terms of its reprocessing, only really needs someone to go through with a pencil and add dates to folders, and that ends up in the student queue. Talking through the notes fields really allows us to be responsive and to dig deeper into the information that Claire has gathered for us. This also allows us to leverage everyone's specific knowledge, as Claire mentioned, and it gives Claire time to clarify perhaps her notes and to talk more in depth or explain more what she might have meant. It allows us to correct for each other's biases, and it also allows us to catch things that each other's miss. So typos are a great example that generally between the three of us, one of us will probably catch it. Whereas if it was just one of us looking at this, we would be less likely to do so. And finally, we're able to leverage Claire's knowledge of the collections because at this point she has been through so many of them. She can draw connections between related materials that are outside of my ability or Ben's ability to understand, or we can leverage my knowledge of Kheel and of ILR and of the broader historical context to identify collections that will probably have better, will hit higher on the score once we give them another look. And Ben is very good at identifying collections where we need to dig deeper to find records of marginalized groups. Here is a quick example of one of the more interesting things that was surfaced during the survey. So we have three collections here, each of them documenting various working women's institutes that were formed at ILR. Collections 3099, 3099M, and 4354003. The ILR school has many different institutes, centers, and programs, and over its many years, they are named very similarly, and this can definitely be a source of confusion. And this confusion can then be compounded by issues surrounding provenance of records, around issues of documentation of how we got these files, who created them, and then what metadata was created to describe them. The three collections I've listed here all address issues surrounding women in the workplace. They are all from roughly the same time period, and they all frankly have significant overlap in who created these, specifically ILR faculty members like Barbara Wertheimer, Alice Cook, Lois Gray, women who are very large luminaries in the labor movement. What we discovered is that two of these collections were accessioned at the same time, whereas the third was actually brought in November of 2018, after it spent a good 20 or 30 years down in Barnard, having never been accessioned. In the course of our survey work, when we came across 3099, I noted the title that it had at the time, which was the ILR School Working Women's Institute files. That pinged my radar because previously I had had an intern process the 4354 collection, which documented the Working Women's Institute, which was a group that was also a Cornell ILR project, and it was also the group that first documented and helped bring the first sexual harassment suit as a workplace issue. So I asked Ben and Claire to take a quick look at 3099 because it seemed like a perfect collection to focus on as part of their weekly redescription meetings. However, they quickly realized that these two institutes were entirely separate undertakings at ILR, and even though the same faculty were present in both. And so they therefore redescribed the materials to surface the topics of interest and retitled the collection, as you can see in the processing note in the second bullet point, to clarify the difference between the two. Part of the confusion, of course, is that in 3099 actually holds records produced by the organization represented in 4354 regarding how one approaches issues of sexual harassment in the workplace. If this is confusing, don't worry about it. Claire recently told me that one of our colleagues is using the 3099 collection in her instruction, and the students are really enjoying going through the materials. However, Claire has to come in and describe how actually these are three separate institutional record groups, and they are only tangentially related. And I'm going to wrap up quickly with some final thoughts or questions that potentially need answers, which is questions around the provenance of our records, whose stories are in these records, are they ours to tell, and is there informed consent? Because as we surface these records, as we present on these topics, we have to wonder if the people who are present in these record groups and in these collections would have agreed. And I think it's something that we need to think about as we strive to tell these stories. We also have to remember that there is such a thing as a right to be forgotten. And what does that mean with this work? And finally, how are we capturing and communicating our decision? Thank you everyone for listening to our talk. Hopefully we can at least get a couple of questions in.
Great. Thank you to our panelists from Cornell. We appreciate that. That was a great presentation. Again, a reminder, folks, please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. We will not be repeating attendee names. We are just going to ask the question. I have a question, though, if I may, regarding the last slide here with the, is there informed consent? I think that's a very fascinating question to ask, especially as there's an expectation on us to digitize all the things. And in my current place, I'm finding that, I guess for places that have been in business for a long time, there's always a question of a lack of the question of provenance and deed of gift and consent to even have stuff available online for people. So I'm curious, kind of like, can you flesh out more of what these discussions are looking like for you all regarding about telling these stories and informed consent? And how do you intend to navigate or expect to navigate this question, especially with the again the whole question of digitization potential?
It's something we wrestle with pretty extensively, especially given so many of our records are union records. So we have a lot of materials that do have a lot of concerns about privacy, and we frankly don't have a good answer yet. Currently, we have a lot of systems in place, mostly on our public services side, to ensure that while researchers might use the material, whether or not they can be reproduced as is are at the discretion of our director and public services staff. But yeah, it is something that we struggle with, and while we have these discussions, we have not really landed on a great answer, unfortunately.
Thank you. So we have a question. Can you please expand on the right to be forgotten? It's an interesting perspective that you don't hear much about. And thanks for a great presentation.
Yes, the right to be forgotten, which I believe is actually enshrined in law in the EU, is essentially that people have control over how their image and information about them is disseminated, and should they decide that they no longer want to be present in the public record, it is their prerogative to remove it. And that sometimes really flies in the face of our sort of ideas of, well, no, it's history, so therefore we should make it available. And it really actually comes a lot to play in ideas around repatriating objects to other cultures, or sometimes, frankly, in terms of questions of safety around, say, members of the LGBTQ activist communities who may no longer want their activism and materials widely available for fear of reprisal and danger. And I think sometimes we're so focused on telling stories that we don't think enough about what are the long-term consequences, and we should allow people to be able to be forgotten if they think that's what's best for them and their safety.
How do you identify marginalized people in your collections whose identity may have been obscured or otherwise hidden in the past, such as LGBTQIA+ folks and people with disabilities?
Ben, do you want to take this one?
Sure, but feel free to jump in. For an issue like this, that's a great question. If their identities were hidden in the past, a lot of times with our collections, we're dealing with rank and file folks from unions. We don't necessarily have a lot of information about these folks. So if it's hidden in the collection, it's often going to be hidden to us, and we do our best with the information that we have. But unfortunately, we can't surface everything. So I don't really have a great answer for how we would identify those folks whose identities are have perhaps changed, or are just not it's not something that we can read through the actual collection material. Do you have anything you want to add, Liz or Claire?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's definitely something that I think about as I'm checking boxes. The question of people with disabilities is really interesting, actually, because we have a lot of cases, labor cases, grievances that workers have filed that often involve some kind of physical injury. And so sometimes we do have documentation of a worker who has acquired a disability through a work-related incident. So that kind of thing is easier to surface. And as for the question of LGBTQIA folks, like Ben said, it is difficult. It's not something that shows up visibly a lot in our collections, and I think it's something that we do have to kind of rely on our institutional and historical knowledge of the people that these collections are about to surface them if they're there. But as Ben said, it's not a perfect process, and we will lose some things, unfortunately.
And then finally, I'll say sometimes we think that there might be something. So, for example, we got the papers of various flight attendant unions with records from the late 70s to the early 90s. And in doing some initial processing, there were some interesting, very brief mentions of health discrimination against male flight attendants who were displaying specific illnesses, which now we know were early people with HIV. And there was some hope that there would be some more documentation in there about the ways that discrimination surrounding people with that disease manifested. And it turned out that wasn't actually deeply documented in those records beyond a couple of mentions. So sometimes we'll go in thinking that we'll be able to surface more things about that, and it turns out that it's so hidden that it's not even in our record, unfortunately.
Okay, has the Kheel Center's policy officially moved away from using MPLP for processing collections?
Yes, I wouldn't say that MPLP was ever it never rose to the level of this is our policy, this is our process. It was very much a specific approach to a real problem that got sort of, I think, enshrined in practice. But yes, no, I would rather we describe our collection well, but that being said, we do get occasionally huge organizational records, and sometimes we will rely on the file hierarchies created by the organization and use a slightly more MPLP approach. So I guess the answer is it depends on the collection, what our approach will be.
Okay, so an individual recently initiated a social justice project to help identify underrepresented population. Have the groups you are working to identify continue to have the groups you are working to identify continue to grow as you review collections? What have you found that has surprised you?
I'll let Claire and Ben field this one.
The first that comes to mind that I didn't anticipate at when, we first started talking about, which marginalized groups we would expect to find in our collections. It's been people in the global South, especially people affected by US imperialism, and how that is tied into the big labor unions and their effects on the rest of the world, especially in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. So that's something that's come up a bunch of times that I think we reframed a little bit and realized that this is something that we actually want to identify and redescribe through this survey. And I don't think it really hit me until we saw it, and I was like, oh no, of course, like this definitely matches the thrust of the project and the principles that we're going off of. But it wasn't evident from the start of the project, so that kind of expanded my perception of it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the number of kind of international collections that we've surfaced has been more than we've all expected. And those are definitely things that we're prioritizing reprocessing now. One example that stands out for me is also a collection of documents related to farm workers and migrant workers in the 1930s in Imperial Valley, California, that we found in a faculty member's papers, but actually has a lot of like original documentation from the 1930s about strikes that were happening that involved a multitude of minority groups and marginalized groups all kind of working together, sometimes in conflict with each other, but it included Mexican workers and Filipino workers and Japanese workers. So that was also something that definitely surprised me to find, especially since it's not really in Keel's collecting strengths, but it is something, now that we found it, we can say that we have and be aware of that and let researchers know.
Okay, could you talk more about sustainable stewardship? How are you putting that into practice on the day-to-day?
Sorry, struggling to find my unmute button. I think sustainable stewardship, there are sort of 3 tiers to that. And the first one, frankly, is staff sustainability. This is a huge amount of work, and we have to make sure that it is a long-term and sustainable project, because I think so many processing projects are on grant funds or on contingent labor, and they're not sustainable over the long term. And so one of the things we've tried to do with this survey project is to make sure that the amount of work we're asking people to complete is reasonable and feasible, and can continue for the foreseeable. I also think that we need to be, I'm working more with my director to talk about how we acquire collections, the size of things we bring in, and more clear about what our capabilities are, both in terms of the space we have to house them, the time we would have to process them, and can we do right by these materials? And then also, again, going back to questions of, are these our stories? Are we in fact the correct repository to hold these? Is there a way that we could work with a community where they could maintain their records and we could offer support? And then finally, I think sustainable stewardship on its most basic level is just making sure that everything we have is well housed and well described, because a box full of papers that aren't well described and aren't well housed aren't really helping anybody, regardless of where they're sitting. Ben or Claire, do you want to jump in and add to that, or?
I think just to your last point, if you all imagine some of the boxes that Claire showed photos of with those wacky spacers in them and similar, sometimes worse problems in the collections, these are the kinds of things that we sort of early on in designing the survey, before we really completely fleshed out what the goals of it were. A lot of what we were looking at was redescription and the conservation concerns like the spacers, etc. These things sort of they became unavoidable as we started looking at collections to analyze their descriptions. And that's when we really realized that, if we are the caretakers of these materials, that we also, in addition to describing them right, we really need to make sure that all of the housing is up to spec for us. So I just wanted to add that onto your last point, Liz.
Do we have any more questions? Okay, looks like Q&A may be wrapped up. You all, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really enjoyable.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, and thank you for attending.
Thank you, everyone.